Hey everybody, this is Mr. Mob coming at you with another APGov video. Today we're taking a look at topic 5.4, how and why political parties change and adapt. So, as the title implies, we're just taking a look a little bit about, the history of political parties to some degree, and how the evolution of these political parties affects us today. So, one of the things we have to kind of keep in mind is that when we talk about political parties, first off, always remember political parties are organizations that exist to win elections. They are not ideologies. So when we do talk about political parties, they can evolve in terms of their ideologies over time. However, we've also seen in our nation's history the very parties themselves change over time in terms of some, continue on, and others fall by the wayside over time. So, with that in mind, let's take a look at the history of at least the existence of the major parties in American history. And, when the Constitution was created, you got to remember that the Founding Fathers created a Constitution without the intent of having political parties. However, humans being what they are, political parties aren't going to take long to find their way into the governing and political process, early in the 1790s with the emergence of Alexander Hamilton's Federalists and Thomas Jefferson's Democratic Republicans. And the first generation of American history, independent history, is going to be defined by these two political parties. And, when we look at the values of these two parties, it really is mostly about what should be the size of the national government, and what should its responsibilities be. And, Hamilton's Federalists believed in a strong central government. They believed that a strong central government was necessary to provide the help for American businesses that Federalists really wanted. Federalists, remember, envisioned a more urban society with, bustling factories and businesses and, and international trade and all those kinds of things. Whereas Jefferson's Democratic Republicans, had this vision of America that was going to be, kind of bucolic and rural and, agricultural based and whatnot. And these folks tended to be still, probably more, affected by the sense of tyranny from British colonial control a generation previously. And so they did not trust a big central government. A big central government meant a large national standing army, which meant tyranny and a lack of identity for states. So these folks wanted a smaller federal government, more power for the states, and that's going to kind of define these two parties. The Federalists believed in a broad interpretation of the Constitution, whereas the Democratic Republicans believed in a much more narrow interpretation of the Constitution. Now, even though the Federalists will kind of be the dominant party of the 1790s, by the time we get to the 1800s, that will begin to change. We're going to see, for example, the death of Alexander Hamilton rocked the Federalist Party pretty badly, and they're never really quite the same after that. They kind of go into decline. Actually, even before Hamilton's death, actually, with the election of Thomas Jefferson, and they're already in decline by the time we get to the War of 1812. They had pretty much been relegated now to the New England area of the country, but following the infamous Hartford Convention, where it was kind of implied that the Federalists, were opposed to war with Britain and would even threaten secession from the Union in New England if they didn't get out of the war. And, it basically painted what was already a dying party with the brush of, being traitorous, perhaps. And so that would be the end of the Federalist Party by, the end of the 18-teens, which then brings us into the era of good feelings. The era of good feelings is going to be defined as really one-party rule in American history, and it's a unique time. It never happened before, and it's never happened since, where the Democratic Republicans were basically the only show in town. And like I said, it's going to last, probably the better part of about 15 years or so. But, as humans do, they don't stay on the same page in terms of being a part of the same political organization forever. And Andrew Jackson will play a big role in that. Andrew Jackson will basically be the founder. He and Martin Van Buren will be the founders of what is now today's Democrat Party. The same Democrat Party of Obama and Biden starts with Andrew Jackson and Martin Van Buren. And these folks believed in a small federal government, relatively speaking. In other words, don't spend money on infrastructure, keep the size of the military limited, protect states' rights, generally in terms of slavery as well. And those that really hated and criticized Andrew Jackson, these folks ended up becoming the Whigs. And that name Whig is taken from England as those that are willing to kind of challenge the king. And that's obviously making reference to Andrew Jackson as perhaps being an authoritarian, almost king-like president, at least by his opponent's perspective. And these folks kind of inheriting the old Federalist mantra of a strong federal government. You got to have tariffs to protect American businesses, and a focus on urban trading America, and certainly a loathsome attitude for Andrew Jackson. Now, the Whigs are going to last for about a generation, and they will have some important leaders, people like Henry Clay and Daniel Webster, John C. Calhoun for a time. They're all going to be very, important leaders in the antebellum era. And they even get two candidates elected president, William Henry Harrison in 1840 and Zachary Taylor in 1848. Unfortunately, the two guys that do get elected president, they don't last very long. Both die very, very soon into their presidencies and aren't able to make much of a mark. And the guys that probably should have been elected president, if you're talking about like the most talented of the Whig Party, probably most importantly Henry Clay runs for president 3 times and loses 3 times. So the Whigs just really strike out. They just can't, they can't avoid bad luck. And by the time we get to the 1850s, like every other institution seemingly in America at the time, slavery is going to rip the Whig Party apart. The Democrats will barely survive the antebellum era. They come this close to severing as well along North and South lines, but they do stick together. The Whigs can't survive it. And so by the 1850s, the Whigs are gone, especially once you see the death of Clay and Webster and some of these other folks. And from the ashes of the Whig Party, you see in 1854 the emergence of a party who is initially founded as an anti-slavery expansion party, and that's going to be the Republican Party. Now, the Republican Party is going to take on many of the old Federalist/Whig values, for example, promotion of business, high tariffs, that kind of thing. But today's Republican Party, of George W. Bush and Donald Trump, it starts as an anti-slavery expansion party in the mid-1850s. And ever since the Civil War era, those have been the only two major parties in America. So, we're now going on about, over 160 years now of the same two parties dominating American government. It's pretty amazing, and it does create a sense of a tie with the past in terms of the continued existence of these two parties. Now, that being said, political parties are going to have, their heyday in terms of power and influence, particularly in, the late 19th century, the era of political bosses and political machines and all that kind of stuff, back when parties, used to be the ones that actually provided, public services like fire and, police protection and, all that kind of stuff. And so back in the day, the parties really dominated elections. In other words, if you wanted to run for office, even president, you had to kind of follow the direction of the leaders of the respective parties. And so there was for a long time, really up until the 1960s in many respects, a sense of that you voted Democrat or you voted Republican regardless of candidates. Well, that starts to change by the time we get to the 1960s, and technology is going to be playing a role in that. By the time we get to the 1960s, we had already seen Americans starting to become more and more connected to the use of television and the ability to see the candidates themselves regularly on television, be able to hear them speak, on the radio a generation earlier, but now also on the television, is going to allow these candidates to be able to run their campaigns with a lot more independence than back in the old days. Basically, you really could not get elected unless you were under the direction of the parties, because the parties had the money. They were the ones that were able to fundraise. They were the ones that were able to give you the resources to be able to win. Now, by the 1960s, now campaigns can kind of do that to some degree independently of the party. So in other words, they can raise funds themselves. And if you can raise the money independently of the party, well, then the party leaders don't have as much control over you, as we would have seen in the past. Another thing that's going to kind of be driving more of these candidate-centered campaigns and weakens the power of these, major parties is there was a sense of kind of questioning traditional authority during the 60s and 70s, during the time of the Vietnam and the counterculture and Watergate. And, political parties, like the Republicans and Democrats, were very old traditional institutions. And for a long time, people just accepted that authority. In other words, you just accept the candidates that those parties nominated. And the people, remember, didn't have much of a say in who these candidates were going to be, who the nominees were going to be of their respective parties. It was, behind closed doors, party bosses at the national, state, and local level making these decisions. It was basically all insiders with, already disproportional power over the, compared to the average American, making the choices for who the average American can actually choose to vote for. So that starts to change by the time we get to the 1960s and 70s, and we start to see today's modern campaigns, in many respects, kind of dictating what the parties do. A great example of that is Donald Trump in 2016. Donald Trump is, going to be, taking over the Republican Party in a way that we really haven't seen a candidate do to a national party. For example, the Republican Party, up until 2016 was historically, the party of, free trade and business owners, at least free trade over the last, 30, 40 years or so. And Trump comes in and says, no, he is a protectionist. And you've got Republicans that are then going to be switching to the idea, well, okay, we need to be raising tariffs on Chinese goods, for example. And so what used to be the parties, the party organizations, playing the music and the candidates having to dance to it, we've kind of seen that reverse now, with the candidates playing the tune and the party apparatus having to kind of dance to it. And so, candidates today still need political parties. They still need that label, but they're not beholden to the parties like you used to see candidates for office used to having to be. All right, so we'll leave it there for right now. We'll see you next time. Bye-bye.